Welcome to this episode of Sexuality After. I'm here with Edy Nathan, who is a public speaker, therapist, sex therapist, EMDR practitioner, hypnotherapist, and author of the book It's Grief, the Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. She teaches people to dance with their grief, to know it as a way to know themselves. And something I saw on your website that I really loved was you mentioned that it's not just loss of a loved one, like that's usually what we think of when we think of grief and loss. But you also mentioned loss of a limb or the loss of the life you once knew. And so I just love that you made it a little bit more holistic. And I'm sure there's a million other ways or reasons why we experience grief. So I really love that you brought that in.
Oh, great.
Is there anything else about who you are or what you do that you'd like to mention?
No, you covered it. You did a great job. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah.
um, I would say my biggest question, like my biggest burning question, I always start with it, is you talk about relationship grief and sexual grief in relationships. And then you also talk about little grief and big grief in kind of in connection with relationships. Can you talk about that a little bit and explain to me how you see those things and how you see it play out?
I was walking on a path one day and I saw this huge bird. And this bird was just stunning. And I found that the name of this bird was a sandhill crane. And this sandhill crane was like, oh, I don't know, maybe I don't know, 300 or 400 feet away from me. And I looked at it and I love nature. I think that nature tells us a lot about ourselves. So, one of the things that I really try to do is pay attention to what's around me because that informs how we are in our bodies, how we think, right? And so this big beautiful bird, I stopped and I just started to talk to it, and it hopped toward me, and I'm like, wow, this big bird just hopped toward me, and I didn't perceive danger. Instead, I actually took a step forward, and then it hopped toward me again, and then I moved a little bit closer, and on the third hop, I realized that one of its legs was missing,
Mm.
and this bird was thriving. This bird was existing. This bird did not look disheveled. You know, sometimes animals, birds can look when they're hurt like they're just their wings are greasy, just like the way we look when we are in a fallen relationship. You know, our hair is greasy. We don't feel like showering. We might not even feel like going to work or picking up a phone to, reach out or text or, get onto Facebook. And I realized that there was a message here, and the message was that this bird, against all odds, was thriving in the wild with a missing limb, and that when we lose something, whether it's a relationship, a loved one through death, a lost limb, that we can still thrive. And what kind of superpowers did this bird have to be able to survive? And so it really got me to thinking about surviving, about thriving, and relationships. When we lose a relationship, when there is that grief of loss, we go through a hero shiro journey, and that journey, the journey, is really was written by Joseph Campbell, but I take that journey and I really help people move through it, because you go into the depths of what he calls the cave, and that cave is where you don't feel like you have any superpowers. You are facing yourself, and maybe you're facing other demons as well. When you are in the phases of losing a relationship, it is often a time when we want to blame and we want to say, look at what the other did. But instead, what would happen if we didn't use the energy to focus on the other, yet actually focused on ourselves? Because that loss could inform our next best move in terms of ourselves, in terms of nourishing some parts of us that we hadn't yet nourished. And there are gifts in losses. And there's a design that I use as part of my branding. It's the snake that eats the tail. It's called the Ouroboros, and it's round. And if anybody goes to my website, they'll see it. It's like kind of golden, and it doesn't have to be golden on my website. It happens to be golden. But the idea that it's actually birth and death, and we are always kind of eating our tails and then coming out. So we must kind of take ourselves on in ways, Phoebe, that we never expected we'd have to. And yet, what we get is maybe a better version of ourselves, knowing that we might have to fly, missing part of ourselves. But what do we gain?
Mhm. Beautiful. How does that play out how do you see grief playing out within a relationship? Like, while still in a relationship? And how does that
There,
affect? Yeah.
yeah. And I'm glad that you're naming it grief, because it's there, right? And you mentioned in your intro big grief and little grief, and I believe that we have the big griefs and we have the, I call them the big G's and the little G's, right? And the big G's are, the monumental losses, and those monumental losses can be, of course, the death of a loved one, the loss of a marriage, the loss of a relationship, um, illness, a child who is sick, and also being in roles that we got very used to, like being in a caretaker role that is all of a sudden taken away from
Mm.
us. Okay. So let's say you got into a relationship and the relationship's been going great. Now, the thing about relationships, there are the little G's, and when the little G's are not taken care of, guess what happens, Phoebe? They turn into a big G,
Right.
because they pop there. It's the 7 layer cake. It's what I call the 7 layer cake. They just layer and layer and layer and layer. And then all of those flavors, good, bad, or indifferent, they mesh together and they just form this big G. If each layer were dealt with when it comes up, it would be an entire different story. So when we get into a relationship, for example, we have that honeymoon period. Oh, and the honeymoon period, those pheromones are just, they're going, and we're just so excited. We're not hungry. We can't think about anything else but that person, whoever that person is. And you're just excited, and you're talking maybe to friends, or maybe you're keeping it to yourself, and you just can't wait for the next moment that you're going to hook up with that person, right? And then, the honeymoon phase does abate. It has to, because those hormones and those pheromones, they they can't keep um mutating, and they can't keep coming alive. And so then you find what might be like a comfortable resting place, but sometimes that comfortable resting place, because there's a lack of those pheromones and the hormones that are racing inside of you, can feel like a deadening, and can feel like a grief. And if you then don't start to, like, face that and find ways to make the passion alive, and m- deal with the things that you're now awake to, because in the honeymoon phase, everything is perfect. Perfection doesn't really exist, but boy, in the honeymoon phase, it's perfect.
Mhm.
It's, we're like on a trip, and we're not even taking LSD,
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. So the idea here is that now is an opportunity to have a voice, to be able to say, I got to tell you, when you do this, it doesn't feel good. Or actually, um, I, I sometimes feel pain when I have sex. Or I know that sometimes I'm having trouble performing and my penis is just not doing what it needs to be doing. And I want to talk about it rather than acting like I'm not interested anymore. Because often that's what men will do,
Yeah.
is they will act like it's not a big deal and they will also shut down. And for women, sex may be painful, or they may not be getting as lubricated as they were during the honeymoon phase. And instead of talking about it and trying to find alternatives or making that warm up a little bit longer because they're not ready, they just stop.
Yep.
So I want to give some breath around that because I know I just kind
Yeah.
of said a lot.
No, yeah, that's good. Do you find that those little G's in a relationship are kind of like grieving a fantasy? Or I don't know, I've had a few people that they've had to like grieve the thought that, oh, if only I met the right person, my life would be perfect. Like relationships, this, if I get the right relationship, then I'll be happy. Then I will be fulfilled. Then all my needs will be met. Then, and then they get in a relationship and they have to kind of grieve that belief and recognize, oh, I'm actually responsible for my own happiness and nobody can actually make me happy in that sense. Like I have to take responsibility. I need to take responsibility for meeting my own needs or communicating my needs. And there's this grieving process around losing that fantasy or a childish belief. Do you find that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and you put it perfectly. There's it is a sense of loss that that person, whoever that person is who you had that honeymoon phase with, isn't the cure all.
Right.
You know, it's he, she, or they are not going to make it all better. And if you dare to face yourself in, in part of that hero's journey, like we are always going back to the cave if we dare. We can also just go numb, and numbness, the first phase of grief that I talk about is what I call emotional armor. And that emotional armor is the place that we always go to. It's that first place that we go to, and it includes being numb and being distant and being in denial and having some protest around that denial, and sometimes getting emotionally overwhelmed. And it is, that emotional armor place that we go to. And sometimes that's exactly where relationships and people in relationships get stuck, is the emotional armor. And once the armor is up, it's impenetrable unless you're willing to get out of it, because it's the place where you're protecting yourself from feeling the pain, perhaps of having to face the self as well.
That actually leads into another question I had is for people that have sexual numbness, like they can't feel a lot in their vulvas, or, they can't feel a lot during sex, like physically. And sometimes if they really stop and try to feel and notice, what comes up is grief. And it's like by numbing themselves emotionally, they numb themselves physically, and they face like this ocean of sadness, or like there's this depth of Sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's grief. Can you speak to that?
When the body shuts down in that way, we're responding to protect ourselves, right? So when that numbness comes in, first, I always like to tell people, why don't you thank your numbness because it's been protecting you for a very long time.
Yeah.
Now it's time to have a conversation with it. Okay, let's talk. Let's actually have a conversation, and that's where some dialoguing comes in, where asking people to kind of write a script between you and your numbness, and and you and your vulva, and you and your vagina, or you and your penis, because a lot of times men who suffer from erectile dysfunction, there's nothing physically wrong with them. Okay. And I know you asked the question about women, and I want to stay on that, but I just really, this conversation is genderless. And what I mean by that,
Yeah.
it's not gender specific.
Yeah.
Okay. It is really, men and women within any of our, cisgender community or the LGBTQ community face these monumental issues of shutdown. And so, though the honeymoon phase is great, and there's not that numbness, there after the honeymoon phase, often people will go to that numbness, and then the numbness again is the protection, and so you don't feel anything, and it is the work of getting acquainted with your vulva. It is the work of getting acquainted with your vagina, which then is going back into the cave and saying, okay. Vagina, okay, vulva, I want to get to know you, and I want you to get to know me. And I want you to know I'm not going to take you to places that are not safe. I'm not going to take you to places that you don't want to go. And yet, I want you to know, vulva and vagina, that I want to start having good sex. And I want to feel something when I'm having sex. So we've got to be in consort here to have this conversation.
Yep. Love it.
Okay? And to start to listen. And if you have a partner, to allow them to listen with you at times, which means that maybe there is exploration with simple touching that doesn't have a goal in mind of penetration, whatever penetration is for you, because for everyone, again, penetration looks different. So I'm not going to name exactly what penetration is. And for, those folks in your audience who are listening, and I believe you will understand what I mean if it's, because it may not be, penetration vaginally, and it may not be penetration, with a penis. It could be penetration with a dildo. So this conversation has got to be very open around that. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, my relationship with my body changed entirely when I met my vulva and vagina that way. I've, done guided meditations to meet her and talk to her, and I now have like an ongoing relationship with her, and it's a back and forth, and it radically shifted everything for me, really. And I love that you brought out that this whole conversation is genderless, really. Like these things happen, and they work for everybody. And um
And they work differently for everybody.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea of, oh, I'm going to talk to my vulva or my vulva, it can be very foreign and terrifying.
Totally.
And right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the conversation, because, a lot of times, as women, we like to pretend that there's nothing down there.
Right.
Okay.
So true.
We're gonna okay. And especially if you come from a trauma background, or you come from a background where you are only supposed to know that there's something else down there other than for you to relieve yourself and urinate, that
Exactly.
it's down there. And so the first thing is, oh, there's more down there than just me being able to relieve myself. Okay, so that's like a first step.
Which can be huge
Yes,
and terrifying in
yes,
itself if you've
yes.
been taught your whole life that there's just a down there.
A down there.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right. That's right. And in some communities where sex is really poo pooed, not allowed until marriage, and you must wait for potential even self exploration, and everything about your sexual organs is dirty, and you get the sense of dirty, then your first relationship may need to be with having a conversation with dirty and with the powers that made you think that way. And it's a brain shift. So we're not just asking the body to do things. Phoebe, we really can't have this conversation unless we also talk about the brain and the neural system within the brain where trauma exists. And the grief conversation and the trauma conversation really go hand in hand. So if you're traumatized, you're grieving because there's a loss. And your brain, all of those wonderful neural pathways in your brain, and if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, so the brain is one of your greatest allies. And I think about the brain as kind of a wonderful, brilliant octopus with all of these legs. And all of those legs, each leg is like a tentacle, and the tentacle has all of these feelings and emotions, and they're just alive with inspiration and with shame and with guilt and with joy and with love. And when we are given the negative messages, guess what? Those tentacles are far reaching, and they like to plant themselves so heavily. And this is the work of the brain to be able to say, I'm not going to give that neural pathway, that tentacle, power anymore. I'm going to start to just not feed it so it kind of starves a little bit, but I'm going to tell it what I'm doing so that other neural pathways can actually form. And I use the octopus because what's brilliant about the octopus, when the octopus like loses one of their tentacles, it grows back. And that's what happens in the brain. There's a growing that happens. So um, there that's why I believe that people can change. That's why I believe that people can have this changing conversation with their penis, with their vulvas, with their vaginas.
yes. Beautiful. Um, when we were talking about numbness, it made me think about Brene Brown. I don't know if you're familiar with her work or not,
Oh,
but
I adore Brene Brown's work.
nah, you and I both. She talks about how you can't selectively numb. So if you numb your grief or your sadness or your anger, you also numb your joy and your pleasure to kind of the same extent. Do you agree with that, or how do you see that?
It's when people are numbing themselves or they come from trauma or they and I use trauma, I use grief as my umbrella, because underneath grief I see the anger, I see anxiety, I see rage and role confusion and grace. So I'm always using the umbrella of grief as a product of what helps us, what gets us to our anger. And it is something that we have lost. It is something that we are struggling with. And so I kind of look at the issues that we face, even, mental health issues, sexual issues, as always going around the grief paradigm. So I just wanted to kind of lay that out. And when someone is numb, yeah, there is a numbing, but there's also this ability, I believe, because we're really smart, to act as if and to act as if we're experiencing joy. And we may actually believe that there is part of us that is experiencing joy, and yet it is not in its fullness. It is not in its
Yes.
glory. So
Yes.
that we are acting as if, because what we've mapped, oh, this is what joy or this is what a smile looks like. So I can put on a smile, and it's the mask. And one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book is our masks. And we have so many different masks, and they're great. They're the roles that we play. There's, the mask that I have kind of when I come on here, and it's that mask and it's that role. And then there's the role and mask that I might have with my husband, and the mask that I have when I'm walking my dog, or when I meet a stranger, or my mask when I decide that I'm going to be, a little sexually kinky, or whatever it is. So we are always changing up our roles, or the masks that we have, and they're not necessarily derogatory. However, sometimes we put on the mask, and the best example I have is when we're grieving and we don't want to talk about it, and we don't want anybody in our inner sanctum around it, and someone says, "So how you doing?" "I'm fine. Everything's good." Well,
Yeah.
that's a mask, right? So I agree. And yet I also see that we know how to switch it up, even if it's not completely felt.
Yeah. So, what I hear you saying is that our masks, like, it's not always a bad thing. That it can be a really positive and an amazing ability that we have, really, to switch masks,
Oh, yeah.
where it might become in our way or prevent us from living a full life is if we don't or can't take a mask off, and then it's just always there, like we're always numbing out, or we always have this mask of it's just fine, and then we think that the mask is our face. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah. That's right. So it's the "I'm fine," and then the people around you map that she, he, you're fine. You're fine. And they stop asking. And you're craving for something real, and yet the mask of "I'm fine," that protection is so potent for you that you never really you I don't I you it's much harder to get to what you need.
Yeah. And can you wear a mask with yourself?
Mm. So it's a good question, and of course we can. It's what you don't want to look at, or what you don't want to see,
Mhm.
right? And it's and you can, have many different, you know I use mask, but it's just a switching up of roles of who we are at any given time. And if we go back to sex, and having, that post honeymoon period, and you continue to have sex, and yet sex becomes painful, and you don't say anything, then what you're doing is you're putting on a mask. You're acting like everything is fine. You don't let your partner know that sex is painful, and then it builds and builds and builds until finally your vagina completely shuts down, or or your penis stops working, because you you actually have been feeling um, unseen by your partner in other ways, and that doesn't come out but it comes out in through our sexual beings.
Mhm.
I see
Uh,
you thinking.
yeah. There's like so many ways I want to take this conversation. Yeah, I could talk about this stuff for hours and hours.
Me too.
Um, so, okay, so do you see, I would really, I'd really love to hear a little bit about, like, you work with grief a lot and you're also a sex therapist. I would love to hear, like, how did that come about? And also, do you see, this might be the same story or a different story, but what connections, if any, do you see between grief and sexuality? Like, how do those play in together? So, yeah, that might be part of your story, or they might be kind of two separate things that you juggle.
I pause because the depth of what happens when someone walks in and they think they're coming in for one thing, like their lives feel disorganized, they're not able to have a good relationship, they're feeling depressed and anxious, their anxiety is through the roof, and they just want some help. And and yet what's just walked into the room is grief, but no one's labeled it.
Yeah.
Okay, and it is, and actually Brene Brown really talks about this, um, is the importance of labeling what is going on. Because if you don't label it, you don't you don't have anywhere to go. It just feels kind of amorphous and it's just kind of hanging out there. And we've got our buzzwords, and our buzzwords, oh, I've got anxiety, or I've got relationship difficulties, or just these obstacles are just overwhelming. And it's like, well, now wait a minute, hold on. What are you yearning for? So when someone comes into my office, Phoebe, I'm not asking them to tell me their story, not yet, because they don't know me. And it's not safe to tell me their story. And they're very surprised when I say, you know what, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear your story. I want to hear what you're yearning for. I want to hear what makes you happy. I want to hear, if nothing makes you happy right now, when was a time that you laughed so hard that you peed in your pants, or someone just made you giggle, or something happened that brightened you? Because those questions aren't asked. And then there's a timeline. And that timeline that, I want people to look at is for men and women, what was your first sexual experience and what happened? For women, tell me about when you got your period. Tell me your period story. Because I really want to hear the period story, because that could set the stage for down there.
Yeah.
Okay. That could set the stage for, oh, like it was not good. I didn't know anything about it and I thought I was dying. Because my mom didn't tell me about it, or I was in foster care and somehow, like, it just kind of happened, and some girl next to me said, oh, well, that's what's happening and you're not dying, and here, use this. And so, those stories implicate how we uh, rationalize our down there, or how we love our vaginas and our vulvas, or for men, that first sexual experience and what happened for them. Were they so excited that they prematurely ejaculated, and that sets a story? So the grief to me is you know in our lifeline, and it starts in utero probably, and I don't know about the data, but how those pregnant women talked to those in utero babies. So just a little story about me, like my mom, um, who I loved and had a difficult relationship with, shared with me that she felt embarrassed about being pregnant. And so there was a shame story around being pregnant with me. And so when I came into the world, I think that I had some of that shame, that I was born with already something that I had to work through that wasn't mine but became mine. And shame is different than guilt. Shame is a shame for who you are,
Mhm.
whereas guilt is for what you do, what you've done, right? So we sometimes battle messages that we don't even know necessarily where they come from. And utilizing, you mentioned hypnosis. Sometimes I will help people go back into the womb because our sexual grief and our sexual stories start there.
Mm. So, am I correct in hearing that
Mhm.
um, our sexuality and our grief are very intertwined? That our grief about life and also the big G experiences, big traumatic experiences that cause grief, highly affect our sexuality. And most people don't realize it when they come in. They just come in with anxiety or inability to feel during sex or problems in their relationship. And that you see that it is often grief of one kind or another that causes that.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't always play out sexually. Okay. I would say, though, if we go again with the idea of the numbness, if you're numb in one place, you're numb everywhere. And if you are hit with trauma and, look, sexual abuse, which we have not mentioned, you know, it can, you know, change the entire life of someone and their ability to be in the world, period.
Yeah.
Much less allowing themselves to have sex, but just a complete shutdown and cut off, just completely cut off, completely. I cannot make any moves, and those are the stories from from the darkest of places, and those people sometimes just get stuck in moving from what was an ordinary life into the cave, and they're kind of forever stuck in the depths of their shadows and their negative messaging and their fear and their grief and their trauma, and their nervous system is just always in flashing red. Danger, 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 danger. And the goal of any of these processes is to go from danger, 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 shut down, numb, to moving back into a green light. Let's move. Let's let's allow ourselves to live again.
Yeah.
And is it does it come out sexually? Yes. Does it come out in the choices that we make, even with the partners that we choose? We come from, there the statistics are just in many, many, many articles. If you grew up with sexual abuse or you grew up with physical abuse, there's a really good chance that you may be a physical abuser, or you may hurt another because that's how fractured your brain is. And the goal is to be the interrupter, to be cognitive and behavioral interrupters, which is like interrupting what's going on in the brain, interrupting the thought process, interrupting the behavior.
Yeah. Is it the same process when people are so deeply in their shadows and in their cave that it's hard to even move a little bit, even to live in the world? Is it the same process out of that cave that it is out of the cave of, sexual numbness or um, like a hiding place within your relationship where you're not actually being seen and being, you know, fully who you are? Or is it kind of always the same process to move more into your fully thriving self? And if so, what is that process in your view?
So the cave is it's a process. So it's not just that you land in the cave. If we go through the hero's journey, the hero journey, you start with your ordinary life. That could just be, you were born, and you as you are moving through your ordinary life, you have challenges. And when you face a first challenge and a second challenge, if it is overwhelming, or if it takes you to a place of, your ordinary self can't really exist anymore, that is when it's a place of no return. You go into that cave, and the cave is where the work of the shadow, and the shadow is the things that you don't want to look at. But it is really the place also where you take yourself on. And it is cyclical. It is not a place necessarily of hiding. I think I think that the cave is, you can you can only hide there for so long before the work of the shadow comes in and says, either do your work or get out. You know, um, and the cave is not protection; it's intense work. It's where you strip down to your base self, to your naked self, and you behold yourself, and you look in the mirror, or you look in the mirror with your parent, or with who you lost, or the emotions that you do not want to look at, and those shadows, which I also talk a lot about in my book through the archetypes. The archetypal mother, the archetypal father, we take on those roles. And there is the good mother, and then there's the shadow mother that can be cruel. And it's in the Wizard of Oz, we say, there's the good witch, and there's the bad witch. And yet the bad witch became the bad witch because crap happened, and maybe the good witch isn't as good as we would like to think she is. And
Yeah.
and so it's really being able to go naked into that cave. It's not hiding, it's a stripping down, and it's a looking. When you're hiding, hmm, it's not that cave-like structure. It may very well be, before you enter the cave, it's the resistance.
Mm.
It's the, I don't want to go there. I'm not going to go there. There's no way I'm going there.
Yeah.
And I am going to stay here, and I'm going to shrink and be taken into quicksand. And I can't access my powers, my superpowers. And it is only after you go into the cave that the superpowers, the ability to pivot, come in.
So it's being in the cave and facing yourself and facing your experiences that help you come out of the cave and into your thriving,
Yeah, it
connected
is.
self.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then you also begin to pick out your allies. You begin to say, who do I want to have with me, and who don't I want on my journey anymore? And it is, talk about grief. It is letting go and it is welcoming in. And, the I feel like we can't really have this conversation unless we do bring up where we've been in the last 18 months or however long it's been, this pandemic,
Yeah.
right? And what we've learned during this pandemic, perhaps about ourselves sexually, but also who are we? Like, I learned that though I'm an extrovert, I'm really an introvert. Like, I am really okay being home. I mean, I was traveling and on planes and going to conferences, and I was gone probably twice a month for 3 to 5 days, every twice a month. And it's like, I can be here with my husband and I can be here with my dog Ziggy, and we can all hang out, and I can, shorten my day a little bit, and I don't have to be on the subways and the trains and going to my office and not getting home until 9 and not eating until 10. Now I can eat at 8:30, and it's like, whoa, this is something else.
Yeah.
And not realizing that maybe there was a loss of intimacy that I hadn't even noticed.
Mm.
And my husband saying to me, "Wow, Edie, I didn't know what it was like to have you greet me when I walked in the door."
Mm.
Because he was the one who was always greeting me
Right.
and had dinner. And what a gift it was for me to be able to say, "I got dinner ready and I have soup." And so did that again shift? Yeah. Did I then need to like realize, oh, this new ordinary, and it's a new ordinary. People talk about a new normal. I don't love the new normal because there's nothing normal about this. And I'm not going back to anything I knew. This is a new ordinary.
Yeah.
And so you come out of that cave of taking, I had to go into the cave and I had to reckon with myself. And I had to actually say, I think there are some people who I don't want on my journey anymore. And that's okay. I mean, I can be friendly and nice, but I don't want them on my journey anymore because there's a whole other world. And what's happened is expansion and creating new relationships, and that realizing our pivot needs a pivot. And that's, a conversation starter from a friend of mine, Larry Kay. Our pivot needs a pivot. And we started actually a whole new idea called the Pivot Quest and creating rants. And so, what comes out of all of this is maybe we need to have rants in our relationships about what we want sexually. Here's my 90-second rant on what I want, and you can just take it and
Yeah.
and let's have fun with this. Let's have a rant. Let's have a 90-second rant, and I want. And you can put kink in there, or I want you to tie me up, or I want you to just sit and stroke me without anything transactional. So this time has truly been taking a look and grieving and mourning who we were for sure, and maybe the gift, because there's a gift. It is that Ouroboros of renewal and life and birth, and with every loss, there's a gift. And what are those gifts? And maybe the gift is I got to stay home and spend more time with my husband than I ever have in 20 years. How about that?
Yep.
How about I got to introduce myself to my vulva and my vagina? I got to introduce myself to masturbation. I got to realize that I can't be in this marriage. I got to realize that my husband has been having affairs for the last 35 years. I got to realize that I actually want to try polyamory. Whatever someone's language is, I got to realize that I want to be with women and not with men anymore. I got to tell my family that I'm gay or that I'm trans and that I actually am transitioning, and whoever wants to be there with me on the journey, okay. And I understand if you can't. And talk about grief, it's right there. talk about the gift, it's right there.
That's really beautiful. I just love that. Just that concept that grief is there often in our lives, but so is the gift. So is the joy, the coming more into ourselves. We're often afraid of loss. Brene Brown talks about foreboding joy and how when we do have something amazing and magical, somebody that we love so deeply, that it comes with this fear of loss. Like, you look at your partner or your child and you think, I have never loved someone so much. And then at the same time, it's like, what if something happens to them? Is there a way to just feel the joy? Or is there a way to become comfortable with the idea of loss so that we can embrace the risk and embrace the possibility that, yeah, something could happen so that we can feel the full amount of joy?
It seems as if you're asking the question, can we prepare ourselves for loss? And so in the preparation for a potential loss, we bring it in to the love feeling, the emotion that we have that feels so gripping, as a way to mitigate the intensity of the feeling. Yet, I wonder how present we are with that feeling if we're thinking about something that is foreboding but has not yet happened and may not happen in this relationship. So, what does it do to project and think about something that has yet to happen? And how does it take away from the presence of being in the moment of loving someone so deeply? And does the mind go there of, what would I do if I lost this child, this love, this this life? Does that thinking actually impede true presence?
Totally, I think.
Yeah, I do too. So then is the question, do I need to prepare for this grief? Or how can I be more present and just be with myself and with my love object in this moment? Because those thoughts interrupt me from being present, and I wonder why I need to be interrupting this feeling.
Right. I can see that playing out in the people I talk to as well, that it'll come up like, I don't want to be fully vulnerable or fully intimate with my partner because they might leave me.
Mhm.
Or I've never been in a relationship where someone treats me this well before. And it doesn't sit right because I'm afraid it might not last. Or, yeah, like I mentioned too, like, I can't fully enter into the love I have for my child because I'm afraid that something might happen to them. Like there's this kind of, it's like we have to accept the risk of loss, not prepare for loss necessarily, but like nothing in life is for sure, really. And life is change. And so we have to accept that loss can and does happen in order to fully enter into the love and the joy that we feel.
Certainly, the experiences that precede any love relationship inform how we respond within that relationship. So if we've had prior losses, or we've lost a partner, it's not a divorce, it's not a separation, but a partner has died. There may be, as you go, as you prepare yourself for the invitation of meeting another and potentially loving another, that you could also lose that person. And yet we have a healthy denial of death and of loss. And it's important, because if we were thinking about it all the time, we'd be nuts. I mean, we're already kind of crazy enough. To add in, I'm thinking about death and loss and grief all the time, is crazy making, for sure. Okay. So what would happen if those folks who are saying, I'm going into this, but I'm not going to give myself fully because I'm afraid that this person will die or this person will leave me, then you're never fully in. And that can be informed by trauma and grief stories that didn't find a grace within your body, a place of landing, a place of integration, a place where maybe there needs to be a forgiveness for what you lost, or maybe there needs to be that repatterning within your brain that has yet to happen. And, to give oneself fully, I don't exactly know what that means, because it doesn't mean fused. It means I have myself and you have yourself. There are parts of us that come together, and we might share parts of a house, but we still have our own foundations.
Mhm.
So when someone says, I'm afraid to give myself fully, wow, then what is their grief story? What is their trauma story? And how does the holding back protect them?
So, foreboding joy, the way you see it, like foreboding joy comes from a place of unintegrated trauma.
Or unintegrated grief.
Hmm.
So a lot of people around the grief conversation and trauma conversation, especially grief, talk about acceptance, talk about, I'm just going to accept this. And I guess one of the things that sets me apart from the conversation that many of my colleagues have, and who I really respect, is this notion of acceptance. Um, I think that oftentimes when we say accept, that the conversation around it is, it's okay, it's fine, I'm okay, I accept this. And I don't know that acceptance is something that I think is the best way to frame what someone who is in the latter part of their grief dance, where they land. I'd like to think that where they land is more of an integrative place, where they've integrated the loss to a degree where it's still there. The grief is there. It doesn't just go away. I think that, like, it's like acceptance is almost like saying, it's akin to, oh, it's fine, and I have now moved on. It doesn't seem that we really move on. When I've losing my parents, and losing my partner when I was 27 years old, who, I don't, I will never forget my grief around those losses. Am I in an active state of mourning with them? No. The grief will always be alive within me. It just doesn't take me down. I dance with it. I move with it. I honor it when it comes in, and it can come in the most ridiculous times. I'm walking down a street, and all of a sudden someone walks by me, and there's this perfume in the air, and it's just wafting through the air, and it's like it's my mother's scent, and it's like, boy, I am right there with my mom, even though she's been gone for, 20 years. And it's like, oh, thank you. And I feel that. So it's not an acceptance. I'm dancing with it, and I've partnered with it. And the dance that I do with it is always changing.
Yeah, I think you've explained that really well, what you mean by integrating as opposed to accepting. And I don't have a huge amount of experience with big G experiences at this point in my life, but the experience that I do have has shown me that, yes, like, there's never a point where it's like, I'm done grieving forever. I'm good now.
Mhm.
It's very cyclical, like you said, and it kind of comes up
And it can come up in so
different
many
ways.
different ways. Yeah,
But I just have a few questions that I'd like to end with.
absolutely.
What has been the most surprising thing about sex or sexuality that you've learned as you've gotten older?
That I can still be surprised by pleasure.
Mm.
And that pleasure changes over time. And what was pleasurable may not continue to be pleasurable. Yet the journey of finding what is pleasurable and what can be pleasurable is really exciting.
Sounds very fun.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah. You just continue to be curious, because as our bodies change, what worked, 10 years ago might not work. And yet, wow, it's like I just found this new lube or whatever it is, and now we can play with that. And it is really just keeping the conversation open, not closing doors wherever you are in the life cycle of your sexuality and your coming out.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, if something that felt pleasurable or that they really like stops feeling that way so much, they go more into I'm broken or there's something wrong with me instead of exploring new things and just getting curious about like what else could feel good.
That's right. And, curiosity is also our brain at work completely. So definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And what is one myth about sex or sexuality that you would love to debunk?
That there's a right way and a wrong way.
Hells yes. Can you say more about that?
Ah, not everybody is the same. And one person's joy or desire or sexual fulfillment is not another's. And so there's not a right way as long as you're not unduly hurting another without their permission,
Yeah.
So listen, if you have a partner who wants to engage in kink and you're right there and you create your contract, great. And it's an agreement. And if you agree that you don't want penetration and your partner is on board, great. That's great. So there's no right or wrong. That it's, you know, again, as long as you are not hurting another or you're not um,
Hurting someone else
doing
without their consent,
that's
like
correct.
you pointed out
Or
earlier.
not consensual, and that children are protected
Yeah,
at no costs.
yeah, absolutely. I think right and wrong, oh, that's kind of another big conversation, but shame appears there a lot.
It does,
Yeah.
because of the way that we think we are, or the messages that we got about who we are, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think with sexuality, I have the same boundaries you do. It's consensual. Whatever it is, I don't care at all if it's consensual and that children are protected.
At all costs.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um, if you were in my shoes, what question would you have asked you that I have not?
Can people change at any age?
Mm, love it. All right,
And
go for
yes,
it.
they can. And we write narratives that are maybe safe and confining. And safety is always what we want. Confining is when we kind of have our emotional armor up. And there are people who get married for the first time when they're 75. It is never too late to shift and to change and to open oneself up to confronting their demons, to facing their shadows, and to experiencing love, whatever that is, and sexual freedom.
Mm. My last question is, what is one thing you wish you knew about sex or sexuality as a teenager? If you could go back in time and teach yourself something, what would it be?
When I was growing up, I was pretty badly bullied, and I thought that if I could be a really good lover or I could be a really good kisser, that it would be a way to make the demons of the bullies go away. And I would tell that younger self that that's not true. And that sex and being sexual and using it to make the demons or the grief or the trauma dissipate doesn't usually work. But coming home to the self and dealing with the shadows and not giving power to the bullies anymore does.
Very well put. That is an amazing place to end. Thank you so much. This was very expanding and beautiful and rich conversation. Thank you so much for sharing yourself and your wisdom with my listeners and with me.
Thank you. I enjoyed sharing this conversation with you. It was a pleasure. Yeah.
You can find Edy at edynathan.com, EDYNATHAN.com. You can also find her on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram at Edy Nathan, and on Twitter at Edy Nathan1. Her book is called It's Grief: The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss.